My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about presidents on film. Today we're discussing Reagan, the recent biopic about our 40th president.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today via Zoom from California is Jim Robinson, who always watches the evening news in his pajamas while eating dinner off a TV tray.
Well, I wouldn't be watching the news, that's for sure, Gary, not these days. Maybe I'd be watching Man from U.N.C.L.E. again. I have to point out, this is the 60th anniversary of that show's premiere in 1964, just to make all of us boomers feel really, really old. But the Reagans did like to do that, get in their night clothes and have TV trays set up in front of the TV. They preferred Mission Impossible. That was one of their favorite shows. And their favorite dish, could it be anything else? Macaroni and cheese.
Oh, jeez. Yeah. Well, why not? I mean, you got a White House chef there to prepare it for you. So why not go with macaroni and cheese?
Something really complicated.
Yeah. Okay. So before we discuss the Reagan movie, we have to spend a few minutes talking about our recent field trip. I want our guests to know that my wife and I were in LA for a few days last week. And what a better way to spend the time than making a pilgrimage to the Nixon Museum and Library. We drove down to Jim's place, and the three of us proceeded to the shrine in Yorba Linda.
Well, I'd been there many years before and had forgotten most of it. I thought it was really, really well done. And what surprised me most about it was how even-handed it was. It had a lot of the critical stuff that happened during the presidency on full display, all the Watergate shenanigans and things like that. You've got much more of a experience with presidential libraries than I have. Didn't you find it sort of unusually unhagiographic?
Yeah, no, you're right. I've been to quite a few presidential libraries and birthplaces, and I think this is actually the best one I've been to. Not because it's Nixon, but because it's the one that evokes the most nostalgia. I mean, if you think about it, this museum covers the entire period of our childhood and adolescence. And as you said, it's pretty fair. They don't make him into a saint, but they do emphasize that he was a very consequential and successful president. And by not saying that he's a saint, it makes those other assertions more credible. I did notice that most of the focus was on foreign policy, but I also noted that they did talk about his role in expanding the role of the government with the EPA, OSHA, Department of Education, and everything else. And they act like that was a good thing.
Yeah, well, a lot of that is sort of the go-to talking points for those that are more interested in rehabilitating Richard Nixon than they are in conservative philosophies. He did start the EPA. He started the federal OSHA. And so these are things that, when young people find that out, they say, maybe Nixon wasn't so bad. And he ended the draft, which was a big deal for a lot of people.
Yeah.
You don't have to be a Nixon fan or hater, or even particularly interested in him to really enjoy this library. It's a really good history of the 60s and the early 70s. It's a boomer's paradise.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, but for anybody else even who wants to get a flavor with real artifacts and such, it's really an interesting place. I'd recommend it to anybody. And I was surprised that there was not a crowd of people there on a Sunday afternoon, but a fair amount of people, young people, diverse people.
We were the oldest ones there.
Yeah.
But that's not that surprising. I mean,
we're
frequently the oldest ones there whenever we go someplace.
Well, we got $4 off of our admissions ticket for that. So It costs $25. People ought to
Yeah.
know.
You know, what was it really interesting to me, perhaps more interesting than anything else, was to see that the actual house that he was born in is right
Oh
there.
yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
it's right there. And they got a hold of all the original furniture.
right. So you can see the bed that he was actually born in.
Yeah.
Oh
I mean,
yeah.
it's very humble beginnings, and really a remarkable life, an American life. There's many others like that, including the one we're going to talk about in this biopic. But I just really would recommend it to anybody. You can see so many things of history. You can see some of the letters that were written by the POWs and the ways that they passed their time while they were imprisoned in the Hanoi Hilton, and listen to a lot of audio tapes, including you get to listen to Watergate tapes. So a very, very interesting and enjoyable and evocative experience.
Yeah, you could spend 18 minutes listening to the 18-minute gap, you know,
Right.
because they've
Yeah,
got that tape there. They've got the gap.
you can actually hear the moment at which a conversation suddenly transitions into a buzzing sound for 18 and a half minutes.
Yeah, it's too bad that tape recorder malfunctioned at that minute.
Well, it was an evil force that did it, according to Al Haig.
All right. Well, we could talk about Nixon for the rest of the podcast, but let's switch over to Reagan, who we've never really had a chance to talk about. But before we talk about Reagan himself, let's talk about the Reagan movie, which came out about a month ago. We both saw it in person. So you're on tap to do the summary, and let's hear what you got.
Sure, I'll do my best. It's a biographical drama based on Paul Kenger's book, The Crusader, Ronald Reagan and the Fall of Communism. Stars Dennis Quaid as Ronald Reagan, Penelope Ann Miller as Nancy, John Voight as an aging Russian spy, Robert Davi as Brezhnev, and a smattering of other known names in small roles and cameos. Somewhat predictably, the film opens with the assassination attempt during which Reagan was shot. But the main plot device, the way of organizing the material, if you will, is a visit by a current day Russian spy to the dilapidated home of an aging KBG officer who narrates the story of Reagan's life, how he journeyed from a small town boy to a Hollywood acting career to becoming a conservative crusader against communism, and of course, into the presidency, where his challenging of the Soviet Union, both in terms of rhetoric and a defense buildup, and in pursuing Star Wars and the SDI initiative, basically ensured that the Soviets couldn't keep up. And that led to their downfall. And Reagan is given a fair amount of credit for the fall of the Soviet Union and communism. Along the way, we get snippets, um, scenarios of important episodes and people in Reagan's life, particularly his mother, and of course, Nancy Reagan. The film climaxes very emotionally with first the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, which did not happen under Reagan's presidency, we have to remind ourselves. And then the former president taking his last ride on his horse in his ranch overlooking the Pacific as he's descending into the fog of Alzheimer's. All in all, the film tells a remarkable story, not just about this particular man, but about how someone in America can come from such humble roots and succeed in more than one career and become a major figure in world history.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, I mean, basically, if you follow the Reagan trajectory at all, there's not that much surprising in this movie. It's very standard biopic from beginning to end. But anyway, we'll talk about what we think about that later. I just want to point out that to date, The movie has a box office of 27 million, which is really not that bad for a movie that's had almost no advertising or media attention and was widely panned by the critics. $27 million is better than two Best Picture nominees from last year, Zone of Interest and American Fiction. And the highly promoted movie Fly Me to the Moon, starring Scarlett Johansson and Tatum Channing. So I assume that there's been a lot of positive word of mouth to keep the movie chugging along as it has been. Much has been made in the conservative press about the fact that the disparity on Rotten Tomatoes between the critics and the viewers is maybe the highest in movie history. The critics have given it a 20 rating, while the fans have given it a 98% rating. Almost all the critics, except conservative outlets, have labeled it a bomb. Some of these reviews have been fair in the sense that they're criticizing the artistic quality of the film, but others are ideological, and you can tell that they hate the movie because it's about Reagan. So,
I think it strikes me that this film really exposes the fault lines in Hollywood and in our culture and in our political culture. It took forever to get the financing. And when you consider the millions and millions of dollars hand over fist being thrown at all sorts of dubious projects, particularly by the streaming services, and the tens of $1 million that are being thrown at figures like the Obamas and the Sussexes. And this film struggled for years to scrounge up a measly $25 million. The main reason seems to be for the critical reaction is, oh my God, it's a positive film about Ronald Reagan.
right.
Like as if that's the biggest sin that we've ever seen in our lifetimes, when there are many positive films about even some nefarious figures from the left over the years. So I just think it's an interesting window into all those schisms. And even if you look at the actors that it attracted, you've got a bevy of known conservative actors playing all the roles, most of the major roles in this film. I mean, John Voight
Right.
plays the aging, he's 85 years old, he's playing the spy. And he's known for, being, in addition to Angelina Jolie's estranged father, is known for being conservative. Robert Davi is a very vociferous right-wing conservative. Nellie Reagan was played in her older years by Jennifer O'Neill, and who was in Summer of 42. And she's a born-again Christian and anti-abortion activist, and et cetera, et cetera. There are others. So I think it's really interesting, the cleavage that the reaction to this movie has showed. And even there was complaints that Facebook for a while was banning advertising for the film on Facebook. And they later said, oh, it was an inadvertent, they admitted it and said it was an inadvertent error after Dennis Quaid complained about it.
Well, first of all, Dennis Quaid himself is also a conservative, which I was
Yeah.
surprised to find out. He says that Reagan is his favorite president. But I am surprised that there has been so little advertising or promotion for the movie. I mean, you don't see Dennis Quaid on Good Morning America or anything like that. No money spent on that I'm aware of on advertising. The only reason that people know about this is because it's like Republicans telling other Republicans they have to go see it.
Right, but I think we'll get into this when we discuss history. I don't want to just leave the impression that it's only for Republicans. I think there are many good reasons for people across the board to see this movie without arguing that it's an Oscar potential Best Picture movie. I learned a lot about Reagan myself in this movie. I knew the general outlines, and of course, that he was a Hollywood actor, a B actor, and I knew that he, of course, became governor of California and a leading conservative. But there was a lot of details filled in that I was vaguely aware of. So I'm willing to bet that there's a lot of people that aren't aware of many of these details.
Well, I think that from my perspective, I didn't. I read some bios, and So there wasn't anything in there that was new to me, but it's different to see it enacted. You
Yeah.
get a better, especially the Hollywood scenes. I felt like I finally sort of viscerally understood what happened in Hollywood versus what I intellectually understood happened in Hollywood, especially when it comes to the union, the takeover of the unions and the communism and all that kind of thing. We haven't really talked about Reagan himself yet, and you and I both have a personal connection with Reagan that we don't have with any of the presidents, and so we should talk about that for a couple seconds. I mean, I worked in the Reagan White House and in the 1984 reelection campaign in the Trade Representative's office, and I even once wrote one of his radio addresses. But you worked on him, worked for him even before he was president.
Yeah, he was between the time he left the governor's office in California and became president, he made his living by doing a daily radio commentary, a newspaper column, and such. And my first job out of graduate school was to help draft some of those um, columns and radio shows for him. I didn't have much contact with him, but I had a couple meetings, and I submitted my drafts to my boss, who then personally interacted with Reagan. So that was sort of one of my first jobs. But our experience with Reagan even predates all that,
Right.
doesn't it?
Now let's talk about that.
We were walking out of lunch one day at Middlebury College in the spring of 1975. Now, for those that don't know, Middlebury College is about as far into the boondocks as you can get in the continental United States. It's in a cow pasture in Vermont. And we walked out of lunch and we saw this very out of place figure standing in the quad on the sidewalk on a sunny day, just sort of gazing around at nothing. And we squinted in disbelief. And sure enough, it was Ronald Reagan. So we immediately rushed up to him and introduced ourselves and started talking to him. I think he was put at ease because you were carrying a copy of National Review
Right.
with you.
I had literally come from the library where I'd gotten my copy of the National Review in the mail, and I was holding it prominently,
Right.
accidentally prominently.
Well, the
And
reason he
yeah,
was there, because like a lot of fathers, he was taking his son, college age son, on a college tour. And they had flown into Albany, rented a car, and they were driving around to New England campuses. And Ron Jr. is not really a junior, but that's what we call him. Ron Jr. was in his interview, and like any other father, you don't get to sit in on that. And so Reagan had nothing to do, and had no entourage. So we struck up a conversation about politics, about Vietnam, which was still hot in the news then. And pretty soon, a gaggle of students and professors who were not, let's say, of the same view as you and I or Reagan surrounded him. And what followed was a very interesting and stimulating and provocative conversation about Vietnam until it was time for Reagan to go. And until finally some news photographer showed up and took a picture, and we got our picture on the front page of a couple of Vermont newspapers the next day. But he was very well informed, a very friendly debater. He didn't, what strikes me is you could never have that take place today on a college campus. A leading conservative figure talking about a very controversial subject with no security or anything in the middle of a totally uncontrolled campus environment.
well, that's true. And one thing the movie gets right is his ability to talk to students and anyone really, and make his case pleasantly, unemotionally, and enjoy the give and take. That was a really accurate thing that happened. It was a very pleasant experience for all of us. Those of us who agreed with him and people who didn't agree. He was very respectful to the students there.
And in 1979, before 4 years later, was when I was doing some work for Reagan, and I when I first met him on that occasion, looking a little different with a business suit and a nice haircut as opposed to my beads around my neck and shaggy hair. I reminded him of that. He remembered it perfectly. He remembered all the points everybody was making. And he was very, oh, yes. And he went on and on about it. And we were enjoying how right we turned out to be
Yeah.
because one of the things that the his critics were saying at the college was that why were we involved in a simple civil war in Vietnam? All they want is to, live their own lives, live in peace. And by 1979, Vietnam had invaded Cambodia, fighting a border war with China. And so I was sort of snide and I said, yeah, remember those people were saying it was just a simple civil war? And Reagan picked up the tone immediately. Yeah, just a simple civil war. And he was quite sarcastic. That was a fun follow on.
Well, the reason we all remember it is that we can remember the date is because it was, I think it was April or either March or April 1975, because the debate was over whether or not we should fund the South Vietnamese government anymore. And of course, Congress pulled the plug on funding, kind of like what Biden did in Afghanistan. And same consequence. I mean, the army collapsed and off we went in disgrace.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, that's enough of our nostalgia tour. So, Jim, who would you recommend this movie to?
I think, first of all, people who were fans of the 1980s
Yeah.
and want to get a little relived flavor of that decade. Obviously, people who thought Reagan was a great president, or at least a consequential president, and wanted to learn more about him. There wasn't a huge crowd when I went to the theater on Labor Day weekend in the middle of the afternoon in Southern California. But there was a few members of the audience that were multi-generational. So I got the sense that it was grandparents taking their kids or parents taking their elderly grandparents who could no longer drive. And so I think people that just wanted to get a flavor of what all that was about, I would say. And then if you're interested in the Cold War and the denouement of all that, because in many ways it really is a Cold War movie. And as opposed to, say, a domestic agenda movie.
Right.
That's how I'd sum it up. How about yourself?
No, I would agree too. I mean, mostly people who want to sort of revisit the 80s. It was very nostalgic for me to, because I lived in Washington during the 80s and was a part of the administration during the 80s. And it was just, it reminded me that was 40 years ago now. And so anyone who likes Reagan at all should run out and see the movie. And anyone who wants to know about the 80s should do the same. So what did you like about the movie?
Well, of course, I have to say I liked that it was made.
Yeah.
Finally. It took a while, and it was rattling around for years as a project, and got delayed by COVID and during production. As I said, for me, it filled in some of the gaps of knowledge I had about Reagan's life, particularly his early life. I hadn't really seen that vividly depicted, his relationship with his mother. I'm a soft touch for, mother-son relationships, and I love seeing all that. And I like that they used a lot of real footage. That's always spices things up in a biopic or an historical movie.
I liked the real life reenactments of the Reagan presidency. Those were all very highly emotional. I mean, I'm talking about you've already mentioned the assassination attempt, the Berlin speech, the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, and everything related to Alzheimer's, was brought a tear to my eye. I also thought it was a good reminder of how really dangerous those years were and how very bad relations were between the free world and the communist world. I like those Hollywood scenes. And I was told that in the original cut, there were a lot more about Hollywood. they ended up cutting it way back. As I said, there was nothing really new in there, but it was just seeing how things unfolded in Hollywood made me understand it better. So, and
I'm
I also,
wondering if,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Well, I'm
I,
wondering if the reason, do you think some of the reason for the critical panning might have been the Hollywood stuff as opposed to the Reagan presidency stuff? Because in a way, Reagan's sort of been adopted as a president that it's okay to sort of like. But when they got into the Hollywood vignettes, particularly showing that there really was some communism in Hollywood, it wasn't all just a concoction of fevered right wing imagination. I'm wondering if that might have rubbed some people the wrong way.
that is possible, although we're talking about things that happened in the 1940s. That's not as much of a hot button issue as it was. But I read a lot of reviews on this movie, and there was still a lot of white hot heat, um,
Mhm.
hatred for Reagan and Reaganism, and cutting social programs and not talking about AIDS. And they're bringing up all this stuff that people were really didn't like him for back then. And so I think that's probably as much as the Hollywood scenes didn't cast a very good light on Hollywood. I think it was the presidency that was the real problem.
Did you like the vignettes that they would resort to? They had so much material.
Yeah,
So there's
right.
always a challenge of how to organize the material. But did you like the various vignettes where they try to inject, some humor, like, when he was hawking cigarettes and things like that, for advertising on television? I haven't decided what I thought about those. I think some of them worked. Like that, I thought was quite funny. But then when they had a surfer bum type come into the Oval Office, I think meant to be Dana Rohrabacher, when Reagan was president and wanted to write speeches for him. And that was tried to inject a little humor. That didn't really work. So, what did you think about? Did you like or not like some of those scattershot, anecdotal type vignettes they threw in?
So some of those vignettes are actually true.
Mm-hmm.
He really did have that cheesy Las Vegas show when his career was in the toilet. He really did hawk the cigarettes. Some of seems so bizarre that it's hard you think they're over exaggerating, but it ended up to be true. So I didn't mind that. I gotta say the thing with Dana Rohrabacher coming in as a surfer dude, I thought that was terrible. It really almost ruined the movie for me because I know, what they do is they have someone who's definitely, they call him Dana, I think. So it is Dana Rohrabacher who shows up on the president's lawn, sorry, Governor Reagan's lawn when he's running for even before then, I think, when he was
Yeah, he
governor.
wanted to write conservative
Right.
speeches for
So it's
Reagan.
a conservative dude who's a surfer dude, and then he somehow gets into the governor's administration, Governor Reagan's administration. Then they have him come to Washington when things aren't going good for Reagan because his speeches are so mediocre. And he walks in. He was wearing a Hawaiian shirt, and he wasn't carrying a surfboard, I don't think, but he might as well have.
Yeah, but it
And
couldn't have happened like that, right?
no,
You
of
wouldn't.
course not. And,
That's
and the thing is,
ridiculous.
everything to do with the speechwriting team after that is all about Dana did this and he wrote this and it ruined the movie for me because I was so close to this. First of all, our old boss Ken Kachigian, those speeches were fine. And it wasn't because he didn't have good speechwriters on his team. It was because, as we discussed with Ken, the White House staff, watered the speeches down. But
Well, it was a brief. It was a brief scene, so it didn't. It
no, but it
didn't.
continues on.
Out,
Like Dana gets credit
well,
for
no,
right.
it's Dana, Peter Robinson, and Tony Dolan
Yeah,
are
but
the three speechwriters hugging each other when
right.
they win the victory of having Reagan say, Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. And they won a victory over George Shultz,
Right.
an infighting victory. And
Right.
I actually thought that was good. And by then, Ken wasn't there anywhere near the
But it was
speechwriting
Peter
shop
Robinson
anymore.
that wrote that line, not
Right,
Dana. You
right.
know,
I know,
and
but yeah,
I
I get you because you were close to it. He is an eccentric guy. I ran into Dana. He was my congressman here
yeah.
in Orange County for a number of years. But before then, I was traveling in Vietnam, in Hanoi of all places. And I walked out of my hotel in the morning and there was Dana Rohrabacher standing in Hanoi for no discernible reason. So he's kind of a iconoclastic guy. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Well, that's putting it mildly. Of course, now he's pro-Russia.
I just thought that was unnecessary.
Yeah.
It didn't move the story forward in any way, really. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Anyway,
on our dislikes,
other dislikes.
I will mark that one down for you, Gary.
Okay.
But my issue, I think the Ron Nancy relationship fell short in the way that it was portrayed.
Okay.
Now, Penelope Ann Miller is a fine actress, but I think she came across as too too much of a sycophant, too frazzled, and too little girlish on another occasion. When in fact she was a smart and savvy politician in her own right and tough as nails.
Yeah.
Now, in a way, I'm glad that they didn't overemphasize that relationship because I was afraid of that going into the movie, that we were going to be treated to hosannas for 2 hours about how strong their love was.
Right.
I'm glad it went into other territory. Not that their love wasn't strong, but somehow I just thought there was something missing from the way Nancy Reagan was portrayed.
I didn't think she did a very good job, or she didn't capture it quite right. I mean, Nancy Reagan was a combination of very vulnerable, very sensitive to slights and stuff, but also, as you said, tough as nails. And she did have those big, doughy eyes that applied vulnerability. But she could then turn around and, break your neck if you stood in the way of something she wanted to do. So yeah, I didn't think that she was. I didn't think that was a very good characterization either. The problem is they don't want to. They didn't want to show what a powerful role she played in the administration because it undermines him. A lot of the reasons that he wasn't as conservative as he could have been is because of her interference.
Which is interesting because I think she just, she was more in touch with parts of the culture
Mhm.
than Reagan was. She was always on the phone to various elite figures in
Right.
Hollywood,
And New
talk
York
show
City.
hosts, and New York City. She was very wired into what conventional prevailing wisdom was and to what it would take for Ronnie to get good reviews from all those
Right.
people.
Right.
And that drove a lot of her
Right.
thinking. Ironically, he started out as the liberal. She
Yeah.
was the daughter of a very, very rock rib conservative father,
Right.
And so it's kind of a switcheroo there. I also thought it did overemphasize the anti-communist theme
Yeah.
at the expense of the domestic
Right.
agenda and the pro-free enterprise part of Reagan's philosophy. I think based on the book they chose, which I haven't read, but the book they chose to use as the source material, and also the device they chose to have, the two Russian spies commiserating over how Reagan brought down the Soviet Union. I thought the cost of that was less. There's
Well,
not
as you
enough
said,
emphasis.
yeah, as you said, you can only do so much in a 2 hour movie. And what they decided to focus on was the anti-communism part, which is fine. But you're right, there was very little about domestic policy in there, which was as consequential as the domestic stuff, as the foreign stuff.
Mhm.
Another thing I didn't like was the framing device of having John Voight narrate it. It was just a weird way to tell the Reagan story by this former KGB agent who's living in some, slummy hotel in Moscow. That's too clever by half to have to do it this way. I just didn't think that worked. And, I basically don't like the assumption of the movie that the reader, the viewers, need to be spoon fed the points the writer and director want to make. I mean, there's a lot of show and tell. I mean, they don't, the director, the makers of this movie don't trust the audience to draw their own conclusion. So they either say what's going to happen and then they show it, or something happens and then John Boyd like has to literally say why this is important. The audience is, it gets a little dull to have him jumping in all the time talking. I mean, so I didn't go for
Yeah,
that.
that broke some of the drama, and it's a concocted device anyway.
Of
The
course, yeah.
the character is at best a composite, if not total fictional. And I doubt that the Russians were sitting around thinking about how Reagan brought them down. But then I tried to think of, well, what would be another device? And that
Well,
it
they could
got
have just
harder.
like if they had taken all of that out and just shown the movie, it would have been a better movie because you could have. I mean, you would have seen what happened, and we're all smart enough to figure out what's going on. We don't need to be told.
Yeah, I don't have as much a problem with it, except for that it did tilt it toward foreign affairs
Yeah.
rather than domestic affairs. But
It's a
you
little
gotta,
confusing to me because what's going on is the John Boyd character is explaining things to this up and coming Russian spy who's being groomed to replace Putin. At first, I thought it was Putin because it looked like him, and it's like that is definitely not happening because if anyone's being groomed to replace Putin, Putin's going to put a bullet through his head. So, yeah. Anyway, what do you think the movie's trying to accomplish?
well, I think it was obviously trying to show that what a remarkable life Reagan led, and what a great American story, rising from very humble beginnings to and changing his career several times in major ways, and trying to show that he was a consequential and overall a successful president, and that he played a major role in the end of the Cold War.
Yeah. Supposedly the impetus for this movie was the director saw a made-for-TV movie called The Reagans.
It was a mini series, I think. I didn't
Miniseries,
see
yeah.
it.
Okay, they trashed the Reagans and they wanted to make a movie to rebut that. Did you see that?
No, I didn't, but I read the same thing,
Yeah.
that he was reacting.
Less explicitly, and I don't know if this is even true or not, but I wonder if there's a subconscious attempt to reclaim Reaganism as the real face of conservatism. The MAGA crowd has rejected both Bushes, but they haven't really gone after Reagan. But they seem to imply that Reagan is about as relevant today as Calvin Coolidge. And I just kind of feel that the movie might be trying to say that pragmatism and appealing to the country's better nature and trying to be nice will accomplish more than divisiveness. I mean, did you get any sense of that?
Um, I would have. I guess my short answer is no, not really.
Yeah.
I would have if he had explored some of the domestic
Yeah.
issues and trade, because
And
then you
trade.
could see more of a contrast,
Right.
than in the foreign arena.
Yeah. I mean, one of the mega issues is no forever wars and,
Right.
and pulling back a little bit and as a world leader. And also, I mean, Reagan is so basically nice and not as confrontational. And yeah, what made me think about this is because when, the movie that I went to, there was hardly anyone in the theater. It was a Friday afternoon, but there were two little old ladies there. And they came out and they were talking to us afterwards, and they were like, "Oh, if only things could be like, go back to the way we used to be like that." I think they feel uncomfortable with the way the Republican Party has turned, and I don't know if that was the intention of the filmmaker or not. But if you've got nostalgia for Reaganism, you've probably got nostalgia for the way the party used to be.
On the other hand, I think one of the points that the movie makes, maybe not so explicitly, is that Reagan himself bucked the established Republican conventional
Oh yeah,
wisdom.
yeah.
And he bucked it by not just nibbling around the edges of government expansion, and especially in rejecting the, Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon, George
Mhm.
Shultz idea, and really the idea of the entire establishment that we have to forever live with mutually assured destruction
Right.
as our protection against nuclear war, that we had to live under this constant threat of annihilation with the idea that the Soviets did too, and that's the way we would all behave. And Reagan rejected that conventional wisdom.
Well, Reagan brought a lot of moralism to his presidency and talked about what was right and in foreign affairs. I just kind of feel like that Trump is going. His view of the way foreign affairs should work is more like Kissinger's, like more realism. We got to not be running around trying to be the world's policeman and all that kind of thing.
Possible. On the other hand, if you remember how Reagan almost won the nomination in 76
Yeah.
from Gerald Ford, it was to invoke a very, dare I say, Trumpian type of style of rhetoric on the Panama Canal.
Oh yeah.
We built it, it's ours, and we're going to keep it.
Right.
When
Right.
all the establishment, Republican and Democrat, wanted this treaty to go forward that basically gave Panama the autonomy over it.
All right. Well, let's talk about the actors. I mean, Dennis Quaid as Reagan, interesting star. He was quite popular in the 80s with Breaking Away, The Right Stuff, The Big Easy, and then has been in a lot of movies, but a lot of movies that I haven't seen. How'd you think about
He's
his?
kind of a B plus list actor, right?
Right.
He's not exactly an A list.
Yeah.
He's not just a B list either.
He could have been an A actor. I read a whole review discussion about him in Slate magazine about how he basically kind of wrecked his career with his choices of movies. Because he was coming on strong, and he's very charismatic actor, but he is somehow his career got derailed by bad choices.
Well, as Reagan might say, he ain't seen nothing yet.
Yeah.
After this role, but he had a really tough task.
Yeah.
Because Reagan, the face, the voice, the personality, is so ingrained in our minds. And understanding that, I thought he did pretty well. I thought he got better as Reagan in the movie aged. In other words, the older Ronald Reagan. My belief was suspended more. I thought his voice was better than his look on many occasions. And so I say pretty good. I think probably I'd say John Travolta was better as Bill Clinton and look and voice in the movie. What was the name of that movie?
Primary Colors.
Primary Colors. Although, that was almost a spoof type movie, so that's
Right.
not a fair comparison. But I give Dennis Quaid pretty good marks. Not
I
great.
thought he did a good. I agree. I eventually came to feel like I'm watching Reagan. The one thing I'll say about the performance is, in a way, he's too human of a character. Quaid humanizes Reagan in a way that Reagan was never human in real life. I mean, he was famously hard to know and frequently oblivious to the people around him. Everyone said that they felt like they didn't know him, but you kind of feel like this Reagan. I mean, you can empathize with him as a human being in a way that you really can't empathize with Reagan, because he was just so aloof and kind of half spaced out all the time. So in a way, it helps you understand Reagan more, but it's not really what Reagan was like. He wasn't like you and I are. He's just some otherworldly thing where he is closed off emotionally from what's happening around him.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And you saw glimpses of Reagan that that may have been true, the Reagan, the person inside, but I don't think you would have seen. And at one point, he's worried about being a failure, and he says, "I'm just going to become a Jack Reagan," referring to his alcoholic father.
Right, right.
And I'm not sure you would have had that kind of exhibitionism
Yeah, I don't
in
know whether
Reagan.
that, right, because that
We don't know. We don't know
we don't
really.
know. I mean, I don't know what he was like in the 1940s before there's all this psychological, psychoanalyzing him because it's, the children of alcoholics, the famously emotionally shut down and yada, yada, yada. Maybe that's true or not, but Reagan was someone that could talk, he could talk politics and seemed to be friendly with everybody. But as Ken Kachikan has pointed out a number of times, he was really introverted in a way, and he was uncomfortable around people he didn't know. And that's when he'd start telling jokes, is when he felt uncomfortable. All right, we've already talked about Nancy Reagan, Penelope Ann Miller. One scene showed me how the movie wasn't really capturing her. It was after the first debate when Reagan had done so poorly, and everyone blames it because Baker and Darman and all those guys did a very poor job of they were cramming him full of information, and David Stockman was attacking him when he was standing for Mondale, and then in the movie she just turns around and kind of pleads with them, please don't beat up Ronnie like this, so make sure in real life she really cracked the whip, and like,
And
this
she
is not
got on
going to
the
happen again.
yeah, she got on the phone with Stu Spencer, and they connived together, and they hijacked the whole prep session for the second time. And yeah, you're right. You're right about that. I look. She may have been faithful to the character as written in her
Yeah,
performance.
yeah,
But I don't think it was terrible. I just think it, and I don't, I'm no expert on their relationship, obviously. Just somehow feel there's something missing in the way
right.
it was characterized.
Right. No,
But
I,
I
I
can't.
agree. I mean, she wasn't terrible, and there were parts of it where I thought she was kind of capturing how close they were and how in love they were. But her steeliness and the way that everyone was afraid of her doesn't really come through.
Yeah.
Jon Voight,
Well, he's pretty good for a man in his 80s. I mean, I thought he was. I'm glad he was in the movie.
yeah,
It's kind of the thinking in conservative Hollywood is you can't get parts. If you're
right,
if you're a conservative. And so I find it fascinating that this movie became a collection of conservative actors. I
right.
mean, Pat Boone was in it
Oh,
as
right.
a cameo, and what's his name? Kevin Sorbo played a preacher. He's another banned from Facebook kind of conservative. I thought he was fine. Again, I didn't mind that device, even though I just thought it was pure Hollywood using
Yeah.
that
So,
device. But
yeah,
yeah,
I didn't really like the device, and I don't know if it's really even possible to do a good Russian accent that doesn't sound like Boris Badenov or Count Dracula. But in this movie, it just sounds silly, because we all know who John Voight is, and this accent is just, I mean,
and when they wouldn't be speaking English anyway
he
in
wouldn't be
their
speaking English with a
conversations,
with a Russian accent, right? Well,
they'd
that's
be
always the
speaking
problem
Russian.
when you're watching a movie about something that's happening in Paris and they're speaking, an accented English French accent. It's always, kind of funny. You want to call out anyone else who's in this movie
Yeah,
before
I thought all three actors playing Ronald Reagan were good.
yeah,
The little boy was good. I mean, just in terms of performance value. And then the guy that played Reagan as the lifeguard in the lifeguard era. I thought they were good, and I loved I already mentioned, I love the mother. I liked the mother son stuff. Nellie Reagan was played by two actors, the older one being Jennifer O'Neill, as I mentioned. And then Robert Davi, I have to call out because He was one of the best Bond villains, Sanchez in License to Kill, the Timothy Dalton Bond movie, and another very known and provocative conservative. James Wood, they needed to have in it.
That's not too bad. Too bad he wasn't there. Yeah, James Wood.
Yeah, another renegade. But that's who I would call out. How about you?
No, I don't really have anyone else to call out. I thought, it was really, I saw the people that were playing the staff. I don't even remember who they are now. They were fine. Pat Boone was funny. Who was he? Jerry Falwell or something like that?
He was one that, yeah, he was
One of the preachers.
one of the
Like
preachers.
Pat Boone. I mean, I'm surprised he's even still alive, to be honest with you. But all right. Well, let's turn to the history then. Let's talk about the accuracy of this. We've already talked about my own personal issues with the speechwriters being personified by Dana Rohrabacher. But what did you think
Which
about?
interests you and about 4 other people.
I know, but it was.
I take your point.
I'm surprised they didn't go with Peggy Noonan, who's much more. You think about all the people that have written for Reagan. I mean, Dana's probably about the 8th most important,
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, what did you think about the details?
I thought, on the broad brush strokes of the history, I thought it was pretty good. And I would vociferously deny that there was no balance whatsoever in this movie.
Right.
Iran-Contra was in there to pretty good detail. The way he was kind of cold and not really treating Jane Wyman, his first wife, very nicely. Kind of distant from his kids and his family responsibilities.
Well, they weren't even in the movie.
Yeah, well, yeah. And then they did, in a vignette sort of way, summarize the criticisms of him during the 80s. You mentioned some of them, the not talking about AIDS, what a lot of people considered the folly of the Just Say No anti-drug program. They had him goofing up the first debate, and in other words, it was not high gloss while still being a positive movie. That's what I would say about the history.
Yeah, I thought the history was pretty good. Also, the generally right on a lot of details. Reagan really did save 77 people as a lifeguard. Although it was news to me that some of them were faking it. I'd never heard that before.
The women, the girls, because they wanted to be saved by him. That was
they wanted. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Tip O'Neill really did visit him in the hospital after he'd been shot.
Did he? I didn't know that, and I was going to question that.
I looked it up. I looked it up, and he really was one of the first ones in there, and he really did recite the 23rd Psalm, although. My friend Kathy Windells has pointed out to me that Catholics who are watching this movie will wonder why they use the Protestant version of the Psalm, which Tip would have been unfamiliar with. They didn't recite it together. That was over the top corniness, but Tip O'Neill apparently did recite the 23rd Psalm to him. So, because I thought I did kind of object to the idea of Tip as being this good guy, because we know he was a nasty old jerk. And
a lot of insiders, and maybe this is why you doubted at first the hospital visit, but a lot of insiders and historians point out that this whole idea of after 5 o'clock to have a beer is total BS.
Yeah.
First of all, Reagan didn't do that.
Right.
And especially on Tip O'Neill's part, he had nothing but disdain for Ronald Reagan.
Right. I mean, those two guys really disliked each other a lot.
Yeah. And that was sort of the myth. It's used all the time.
Right.
I think to sort of browbeat Republicans into being nice to Democrats.
Right. Instead of
like Reagan
never
did.
No browbeating on the other way.
Right.
No one has ever browbeaten Schumer to be nicer to Trump.
Or
Um,
nice to the Supreme Court.
but nice to the Supreme Court. Yeah. So a lot of the details were right. I mean, the thing about that goldfish, that's true. I remember reading that in one of his biographies, or Peggy Noonan, I think, has talked about that, where, when they went to the summit in Geneva, I think it was, they were staying at someone's house, and he was staying in the bedroom of the kid, of the owner's son. And he was supposed to be taking care of the goldfish, and the goldfish died, and he was really worried about what to do with the goldfish while the summit is going on, right? I mean, he's got more important things to
Right.
think about than this stupid goldfish, but it really did happen. So,
Yeah. Do you think the movie did give him a little too much credit for the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union?
well, I will say, I think it gave, I believe in the power of a good speech to make a difference. So, but to give so much credit to his speech writing, and this is, I mean, I can't believe I'm saying this, but he gives too much credit to his speech writing in terms of changing the way things happen, because the speeches were important, but so was change, legislating with Congress, having good appointments and all that kind of thing. So I think too much credit was given to speech writing, and
Mhm.
I kind of I think Reagan deserves a lot of credit for the fall of communism because of Star Wars or SDI. Yeah, I buy that, but
Yeah, I think
because I don't
it's
think it was just that one speech. I mean, you got Margaret Thatcher saying there, what was it, game set match or something, when he said that one line, tear down this wall.
I think a lot of there were pressures from within the communist world that contributed heavily as well. So that's why I think there were just more reasons than Reagan. Not that Reagan doesn't deserve credit. I mean, Lech Walesa's labor movement in Poland, the Pope's activities, um, and just the fact that the system doesn't work. And sooner or later, you know, people get
Right.
tired of going in the grocery stores with one rotten radish in the vegetable shelf. I mean, especially when they're able through media to learn, about other society.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
he was the maybe gets a lot of deserves a lot of credit for being the ringleader of a lot of that was happening. Maybe the most prominent person, in addition to the Pope and Lech Walesa,
And
uh,
Gorbachev
and
too,
Gorbachev
yeah,
too. Yeah,
and
yeah,
Thatcher, but I think where I give him the most credit is to at least start the strategy from the point of view that mutually assured destruction is unacceptable.
right,
That was his real courageous break, and he was ridiculed for it.
right, right.
And so I think just for that to lay the foundation for the pressure that was then put on the Soviets, I think is worth a lot of credit.
This is the problem with a movie like this, where you've got, a soup to nuts portrayal from childhood to basically death. And you're trying to, so much has happened, you can only
Yeah.
like hit the highlights. And I think a better biopics are the ones like with Lincoln, for example, where they just focus in on the Steven Spielberg movie Lincoln, where they just focus in on one thing that happened over the course of 2 years.
Yeah.
The other thing that bugged me, not really bugged me, but there's a scene where Reagan yells at OMB director David Stockman proposing tax increases and calling them revenue enhancements. But it doesn't mention that Reagan actually supported those tax increases in 1982. In fact, the movie is so eager to show that Reagan was a strong leader that it doesn't show how often he was a bystander to what was going on in his own administration and let himself be manipulated by the staff. So,
Yeah. Well, that's part of the consequence and maybe the purpose of having a movie focus on Cold War issues
yeah,
as opposed to the quote unquote Reagan Revolution, which, I think I've said before to you that I think was a whimper
yeah,
rather than a bang almost from the beginning. And that it was pretty much nibbling around the edges. After the first big, great an excellent burst of legislation and
Yeah, well, the
retrenchment.
big tax cuts in
Yeah.
1981, yeah. And I also
Yeah.
like the tax simplification that took place in 1986,
Hmm.
I think, or seven, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Those he was good on taxes, and I guess the best you can say is, although he wasn't able to cut back government, he was able, at least able to slow it. And
Yeah. Although it's interesting that that there was arguably more success with that when you had the Bobbsey twins of Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich
yeah,
in the 90s,
yeah,
which guaranteed a lot of gridlock. And you also had Clinton really wanting to be pragmatic to win re-election. So we actually got surpluses, budget surpluses for a couple of years.
yeah. I know, right? Isn't it amazing that in our
And no
lifetime there were
growth in
budget
government.
surpluses?
And no growth in government. So it's funny how American politics, what dynamics
Yeah,
lead to the greatest amount of change.
right. All right, let's talk about our favorite scenes. This is a little harder, this favorite scenes and favorite lines, because we had to watch it in the movie theater, and I didn't bring a tape recorder or anything, or a notebook or anything. I just had to remember
Yeah.
afterwards. So, what are your favorite scenes?
Well, any scene with his mother, his
Okay,
two mothers, I just thought they were good. I thought they were well acted and touching, a little schmaltzy. And I learned something. I didn't realize how important Nellie Reagan was to Ronald Reagan.
I thought the final 10 minutes from the moment the Berlin Wall comes down, and then Reagan is diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and then to his death and the eventual, I mean, it was
Oh
long,
yeah.
long weep fest. I mean, it
Yeah,
was
I agree.
so
That was
powerful.
next on my list. Yeah.
Okay,
It was really good. I mean, it was well done cinematically too,
right,
especially the riding and the shimmering western sunlight riding his horse. And then the voiceover was reading his famous Alzheimer letter,
right.
which
That
I always,
Alzheimer's letter is really one of the most amazing documents by a president I've ever. I mean, it's so eloquent, and it's hard to believe he was able to have written that when he actually has Alzheimer's.
well, I was always wondering, this is one of those things that I don't want to check the
Yeah,
facts.
I know.
I always wondered, who did that get drafted by someone first? And I don't know what the history says. I don't know what the insiders say, but
I
it
haven't
was,
heard
and
anyone say
he
that.
was a good writer.
Yeah.
He was a very good writer, as his diaries have shown that have come to light since his death. He was an excellent writer. And, with Alzheimer's, you have very lucid days and periods intermixed, and then they just get fewer and farther between. But I never wanted to find out. I want to be content with just thinking it's
Yeah,
remarkable.
I'm in the same way. I haven't really researched it, although I also haven't heard anyone debunk it. And
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
think it's true is because it was handwritten.
Right. It was
You know,
handwritten.
if it had just been, if it was a typed document that was signed by him, I would have thought, but
Yeah.
I thought that there was one funny scene where he's running for governor, and he knocks on the door of someone, and he says, "I'd like your vote." And they can tell that he's a movie star, and she says, "I've forgotten your name." And did the initials help RR? And she goes, "Honey, Roy Rogers is here, and he's running for governor." I thought that was fun.
That was really good.
Yeah, that was funny.
Yeah.
You got any other favorite scenes?
I like the tear down the wall scene.
Yeah,
And I actually, because I was not personally invested, I liked that Reagan basically stood up to George Shultz,
yeah,
and then his little junior speechwriters had their victory as they heard Reagan saying the line. And there really was a huge controversy over whether that line would be in there.
yeah,
And it was Reagan who insisted on it.
yeah.
And I just like that, It just did show you, personalities aside, it showed you the implicit power in speech writing
Hmm.
for important officials in the country.
Right.
for better or for worse.
For better or
Axis
for
of
worse.
evil
Yeah.
and axis of
No.
evil
I
anyway.
mean,
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons that Obama is still considered so favorably by a lot of people is because he was such a good speechwriter. He's very eloquent. Because the privileged class or the educated class love other well-written, well-spoken leaders. So
Yeah. Well, we're in a talking era
yeah,
where how well you talk
right.
is a ticket to career success
Yeah,
in
yeah,
many fields.
yeah. Favorite lines?
Well, once again, we have a presidential movie where the real lines are the
Yeah,
best
exactly.
compared to the scripted lines.
Right.
So I would just say any of his, the lines from the Alzheimer's letter and Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I mean, how can you beat those?
Right. I agree.
Yeah,
There you go again.
yeah.
Um,
I will not exploit
yeah, I will
my
not
opponent's
exploit
youth and inexperience.
from Mondale. Yeah.
Yeah.
All my favorite lines are actually from the wives. Jane Wyman, she says, if you put as much work into your career as you do making your speeches, you'd have an Oscar by now. And she
Maybe.
also says, Jane Wyman, there's nothing more ridiculous than a politician with a cause.
That's a good
No, sorry. There's nothing more
actor with a.
ridiculous. Sorry. There's nothing more ridiculous than an actor with a cause.
You could say the way you said it the first time.
I
True a
know.
lot of times as well. But yeah. Well,
And
that's
then,
a great line for today. That's for sure.
yeah, when Reagan's reading a book and Nancy says, "Would you rather spend time with Whittaker Chambers or me?" You know. But
That has a double entendre too.
yeah. Other than that, I didn't. It was hard to come up with really good lines from this movie. I mean, maybe if I'd seen it a second time, I would have jotted them down. But
It was more the situations
yeah.
that they play.
What do you think the relevance? Let me hold on. We want to talk about relevance.
Yeah, I think that's where
All
we
right.
are.
So, relevance or comparison to politics and society today?
Well, unfortunately, Reagan, who worked so hard to get us out from under this impending doom of mass destruction, was not a permanent victory.
Yeah,
There are, we're living under the potential anyway of, are we going to slip ourselves on a banana peel into World War III? The threat is still there of nuclear Armageddon, except that it's proliferated to a few extra countries. So we didn't make that threat of MAD go away. So I think it's relevant to consider that. Some people think we are seeing the recreation of an evil empire,
yeah.
be it Putin in Russia or the Chinese. There's a debate about that. But I think that makes us relevant. And some of the sides in those debate are getting shifted a little, with a lot of Republicans thinking, no, we don't face that kind of threat, and a lot of Democrats saying, yes, we do, although they seem to be of one mind on China. So I think it's relevant in that regard.
Yeah, and I think, as I said earlier, I think it's relevant to show there's still a wing of the Republican Party that's nostalgic for the old GOP.
Mm-hmm.
But all right, if you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
Yes, I think I would, and with appropriate context provided. And because I think the kids would be of the right age, because they could go and ask their parents or grandparents about Reagan. In other words, it's not that far distant. It's not like showing a movie about Teddy Roosevelt. There's still contemporaneous experience with this president. And we're getting fewer and farther between, but still exists. So I would, yeah.
Yeah, I actually think this is a very good movie for a middle school history class. Although I have to say, I would not show it in a blue state. Progressives complain about censorship all the time, but if you tried to show this Republican propaganda to these parents, they'd probably try and run you down with their EVs.
Gary, so cynical today.
It's not cynical, yeah. Well, and let's grade the movie. What did you think?
Well, I'd say B plus.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's not a look. It's not a fantastic piece of filmmaking, and I'd love nothing more than to give an A plus to a positive Reagan biopic, but it just isn't. It's B plus barely.
I'm gonna give it a B minus.
Okay,
And I guess I haven't really spoken to why I think it falls short. I mean, the narrative device is a problem for me. And narration at all, and I think is makes things too simplistic and I don't think the writing was all that sharp, and the
it's
acting.
clunky. I think clunky is a
It's
good
a very
word for it.
clunky movie. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think that they bit off more than they can chew. I hope that every Republican or anyone who's interested, I would encourage people to go, even though it's not a good movie. You do get it's very emotional in parts. I was a little bored in the middle, like after, when we got into Iran Contra, it's like, we're gonna have to go through Iran Contra now. The ending was very strong. The beginning, if they'd taken any part of his life and expanded it more, I thought it would have been better than trying to go from, trying to cover the whole thing. So I
yeah.
didn't think.
That I don't agree with you on because I think, and one reason I think it's relevant and I was inspired by it is because what's really remarkable about Reagan is not any one month or year or decade in his life. It's just that it even happened the way it did. It's
Yeah.
really so. I think you had to touch on all of it. I mean, you mentioned the Lincoln one by Spielberg that focused on specific, legislative effort.
To the 13th Amendment, yeah,
Yeah, but
getting that passed.
there was so many other films already about Lincoln, and I think one reason I was nostalgic for this movie is because it just showed you, and just getting to what we were saying about going to the Nixon Library, it showed you about these unlikely figures, the incredible lives they led, and that America allows for that. And so maybe their device wasn't the best, but I can't think of another one. I'm not a screenwriter, but I just think I would not want to have seen a movie that just talked about the Reagan Revolution. And he did, and there have been whole movies about the assassination attempt, and whatnot. I just think you had to touch on all of it.
Well, maybe part of the problem is that the director is just not we haven't mentioned his name, and I don't remember who it is. The director,
McNamara, is it
yeah, I don't know.
McNamara? I think
He's just not we did watch another the Oliver Stone movie about Nixon. Is
yeah,
also soup to nuts thing, very similar story. He is a young person, and he's a much better director than this guy was. And also that
yeah,
it
yeah.
was 3 hours long. It was more interesting, and did a better job of, but it was 3 hours instead of 2 hours, and it covered a lot more territory. And again, he's just a much more compelling director than, so
Yeah.
I don't know.
I agree with it.
So any other thoughts before we close this out?
No,
So I'm just going to remind everyone that this podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and most podcast platforms. You can subscribe there. And if you have any comments, you can email me at garyholmes76@gmail.com. Our next movie is going to be something completely different. We're going to do Forrest Gump next. It's going to cover our usual famous presidents, our usual favorite presidents, JFK, LBJ, and Nixon.
don't eat too many chocolates while you're rewatching.
Have you seen that, by the way?
Yeah,
Okay.
a long time ago. I barely remember it.
It's been a long time too.
I remember the music. I like some of my favorite agitprop rock music from the decade is in there.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll see you then. And okay, Jim, bye-bye.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.